Hello and welcome to News in Depth here on TVP World. My name is Diana Skaya. Europe is mobilizing after U.S. President Donald Trump doubled down on his push over Greenland, threatening new tariffs on U.S. allies as early as next month. But now Trump also announced the activation of a board of peace, inviting Poland to participate, signaling a new diplomatic track amid rising tensions. EU leaders have now called an emergency summit, warning that the dispute risks escalating into a much broader transatlantic crisis, raising new concerns over NATO unity and Europe's response. TVP World News Director Adam Jasser joins me now to discuss the latest developments. Adam, welcome to the program. So glad to have you here. Now, honestly, Adam, these developments are happening at such a quick pace. And now, before anything, Donald Trump threats vis-a-vis, Greenland clearly look like he still wants to maintain some sort of control when it comes to quote-unquote peace as peacemaker. As we see today in the example of the Board for Peace for Gaza proposal, where he invited, amongst other, Karol Nawrocki, Putin, and Erdogan, amongst others. What is the purpose of this body? And I have to ask you this. Do you think that this is something that may be happening to sort of shift our attention away from the tariffs that he wants to impose and from everything that has unfolded of him wanting to essentially take over Greenland?
No, I don't think the proposal to form this board of peace for peace is apart from Greenland or trying to pull our attention from it. On the contrary, it just shows that President Trump is on the offensive on many fronts to rearrange the global order. He's been talking about rearranging it for a long time, and now he's making a fresh push. So all these things are happening at the same time, and they happen also, remember, about Venezuela. So, he's enforcing his Monroe Doctrine, saying, I will control the Western Hemisphere. There are now reports that he has renewed sort of his thinking about Canada as well. So, I don't think he's just, he's not shifting from one place to another. He's pushing on all fronts.
He wants it all. He wants everything.
He wants to remodel the world order. And I think this board for peace, which started as a concept for Gaza, for rebuilding Gaza and bringing some order there, the US officials are now sort of leaking out that this is supposed to be some kind of alternative to the United Nations Security Council. How would that work in practice, and who is going to accept this invitation? That remains open.
All right, well, he did invite Poland. Adam, why do you think that Poland's involvement actually would be significant? I mean, what would being on part of Donald Trump's Board of Peace do for our region and bring to Poland?
I think Donald Trump is trying to approach countries that he perceives as his allies.
Top allies. Yeah.
Of course, for Poland, it creates a paradox of being part of the same body with Moscow. So we'll see how it plays out in Warsaw and what the response is going to be. But, it's also not entirely clear how this body, this unprecedented body, where Trump is going to be the de facto new UN Secretary General, because he wants to be the chairman of this body. This is just, he's basically saying, the old world order controlled by the UN Charter, this is history, this is going. The order that America created with allies after the Second World War, this is over. Now we're witnessing the birth of a new system with America on top. And America is going to deal the cards and decide who plays, who's in, who's out, and so on and so forth.
All right, Adam, now if I can just get into the question of tariffs. Now, on January 17, Trump said that he might be taxing 8 U.S. allies, which would come into effect in February if they continue to oppose his much-wanted takeover of Greenland. And just earlier, we saw New Reform UK leader Nigel Farage say live that Donald Trump's tariffs are wrong, they're bad, and they're very, very hurtful, saying he's worried, he is concerned. What do you make of this?
Well, yeah, why are we discussing Nigel Farage in the first place? This is not the only reaction there is.
But I mean, Europe is coming out with their own reactions, right?
Yeah, well, what's interesting in Mr. Farage's statement is, of course, that it reflects the uneasiness about what Trump is doing, also among his allies in Europe. Because Mr. Farage, the leader of the Reform Party in the UK, sort of anti-EU, anti-European, rebellious, very much MAGA-aligned, he is coming out protesting against this approach of the US president. The same happens with Alice Weidel, the chairwoman of the Alternative for Germany, which Mr. Trump and his people have said are the great hope for Germany and their allies. So we have a number of, and the French far-right leaders, Le Pen and Bardella, also came out with strong criticism of Europe. So the paradox of this is that Trump in his national security strategy said that the way for Europe is to become more nationalistic. And now he's seeing that this message maybe is getting through. Europeans are getting a little bit more patriotic about Europe and their own countries, and they're saying we don't like what America does.
Is this a good thing?
So
Adam?
it's good for whom?
Good for whom? For Europe?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in a sense, everybody is saying Europe needs to wake up. So maybe Trump is waking Europe up, if even his allies in Europe are now, in a sense, they feel their identity is threatened by this US behavior. You know, a lot has been said about whether this attempt to take over Greenland is the end of NATO. And we've heard lots of officials in Poland, in the UN, the NATO Secretary General Rutte, all the other officials saying, no, NATO is still there. US commitment to NATO is still there. Maybe it is, but if you look at the NATO Charter, the Article 1st of the NATO Charter says, the parties undertake, as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations. So NATO is making direct reference to the United Nations Charter that Trump is actually saying, well, forget about it, to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peaceful means, in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, and to refrain in their international relations from the threat of use of force. So, frankly speaking, America is already breaching Article 1 of NATO treaty. Even if these threats are only threats and they will never materialize, in other words, even if Trump doesn't really send troops to take over Greenland, the threats he is making are already violating the UN Charter, the NATO Charter. And Article 2 of the NATO agreement, the NATO treaty, NATO Charter, says the parties will contribute toward the further development of peaceful and friendly international relations. By strengthening their free institutions, they will seek to eliminate conflict in their international economic policies and will encourage economic collaboration between any and all of them. So the threat of military action and takeover of Greenland and economic threats against European allies are in direct contradiction to NATO's two first articles of the NATO Charter.
I think I am going to invite you to listen to a soundbite by German Finance Minister Lars Klingbeil, because this really relates to Adam exactly what you just laid out for us right there.
Die Botschaft, die für mich unmissverständlich ist,
The message, which is unequivocal for me, is that we will not be blackmailed and that we stand together in solidarity in Europe. We have a broad range of options for responding to President Trump's threats, provided he actually implements these tariffs. Here in the European Parliament, we have the tariff deal that needs to be ratified and approved. That's on hold for now. We have agreed on countermeasures within the European Union, which we will not prolong and which can come then into effect at the beginning of February. And I want to emphasize that we also have effective legislation at the European level that we can apply if we are subjected to economic blackmail, and which can include very sensitive measures. And I want to make it clear that these measures must now be reviewed and prepared in case President Trump maintains these tariffs.
Adam, we heard it right there. Blackmail, you said threat, economic blackmail. We have agreed on countermeasures. Is this a turning point in how, I'm going to ask you again, Europe is going to deal with Trump? I mean, are we seeing less accommodation and more preparedness for retaliation?
We don't know that. What we know for sure is that Trump is accelerating this alternative world order, and he's doing it by coercion. So now the question is how Europe is going to respond, and I think some of the meetings that will take place in Davos, I'm sure there will be some backstage discussions between President Trump, US officials and European officials who will be attending. So I think the reason why the special EU summit has been called for Thursday is to give leaders some wiggle room to still negotiate and figure out. The EU, as we all remember, agreed not to retaliate against the previous tariffs and accepted the tariffs. And the argument openly, more or less, was that we don't believe the US tariffs are right for us, but at the same time, we value US presence in Europe. We're dealing with belligerent Russia, and we need US involved in European defense and in helping Ukraine. So we're going to back off from any retaliation. Now, they're saying they will use tools that they've got, which range from tariffs to access to markets to regulation of US platforms. So they're saying, we have a bazooka, and the two leading countries in Europe, France and Germany, are now saying that they are ready to use it. Well, on Thursday, we'll find out.
Adam, you did mention earlier on Russia initially in our conversation. How do you think Russia is reacting to all of this? And I mean, looking at this, isn't this something that's coming out as an advantage for Russia, seeing the West essentially
destroying itself? Well, Russia's design has always been to get America out of Europe and to deal directly with big European powers, Germany, France, Britain, and ignoring interests of smaller states.
So they're laughing.
The whole idea of the European Union was to prevent a situation where smaller nations in Europe will again be at the mercy of big powers. So for the Russians, the fact that Trump is prepared to risk the cohesion of NATO and the cohesion of the Western alliance, it's obviously a welcome sign. And, the sort of bitter irony of all of this is that this is coming when peace in Ukraine is still elusive, and when Russia seems to be really struggling to keep its momentum in the war going. Despite all the destruction, despite the attacks on the energy infrastructure, they're not really making progress. So in a sense, it's just amazing that Trump is throwing them a lifeline at this particular moment and invites Putin to
the board of peace.
That board of peace. I mean, it becomes Orwellian, if you will.
Let's listen to the head of the trading at Odo BHF, Oliver Roth.
I believe that the Europeans now realize that appeasing Donald Trump will not get us anywhere in the long run. And Donald Trump's closest confidants, who no longer work for him, have repeatedly pointed out that Donald Trump only responds to strength. And that is exactly what Europe must now demonstrate if Donald Trump sticks to his position. Europe must stand together, stand up to Donald Trump, and, if there is no other option, take the toughest measures. Donald Trump apparently does not understand any other language.
Adam, I know it's a little bit difficult to predict. I mean, we do have a meeting that's going to happen in a few days. I mean, you said that, again, it might, the Davos on the sidelines, behind the curtains, might just buy certain officials some time. How do you personally view this unfolding situation, say, 2 weeks from now? or
no,
next
I'm
month?
not going to get into that trap. But what I will say is that Europe, the European Union has the tools to respond. It's true what this gentleman just said, that the strategy, European strategy so far of this appeasement kind of strategy has not really worked that well. But at the same time, there may be limits to what Europe can realistically do, because at the end of the day, the political scientists would say Trump has escalation dominance. So in other words, if Europe decides to respond with an escalation to a US escalation, so tariffs and then countermeasures from Europe,
Becomes a tit-for-tat situation.
then Trump can escalate further, and I'm not entirely sure the Europeans have that much to respond then, because then they're jeopardizing also the Ukraine situation. And the most important factor of all of them is Europe is energy dependent. And given that Europe has largely switched off Russian gas and oil supplies, a lot of these supplies are these days coming from America. So in other words, Trump, as we know, doesn't shy away from using economic tools to get his way politically. So there is a certain escalation spiral here, a potential for it. And I think everybody remains to be convinced that Europe is prepared to go all the way. So I think the dominant feeling in Europe is what the British Prime Minister said, that still this can be avoided. And certainly in Poland and in our region, this is of particular concern, because Poland and other eastern flank countries are directly exposed to Russia. They're fearful of what happens to Ukraine, but at the same time, and they're, for Poland, the US is a crucial ally, vital ally, and Poland still hopes that it's a dependable ally. But if Poland and others are forced to choose, that is not going to be an easy one.
And just really briefly, before we end this episode, Adam, what do you think on Donald Trump's comments where he said that since he didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize, he doesn't need to formally focus on peace anymore?
Well, I think a lot of outrage about what Trump says on various occasions is taking attention away from the fundamental change that he's imposing on the world. So, yes, it's outrageous. A lot of people get very worked up about things like that. But at the end of the day, this is just noise. The real trouble is that he's really going ahead with changing the world order and undermining the unity of the West. So the big question for America is, and we saw in the material in our news service just before our conversation, that even in America there is big uneasiness whether America can be alone without allies, or with allies that are coerced into cooperating with America. So that's the big question for Trump. And he's racing against time because, the midterm elections, so a new round of elections in the United States where the Congress may the Republicans may lose control of Congress. This is approaching. Domestic ratings aren't great. And he seems to be in a bit of a rush to get his will imposed on everybody
to get his way
before that happens.
Thank you so much, TVP World and News Director Adam Jasser, for breaking it down for us here on News in Depth. And thank you for watching this episode. And do stay with us here on TVP World for more news and exclusive interviews.